Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're going to get started in about 1 minute.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I need to let you know that we are recording this webinar. So I'm Judy Rohr. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program at Eastern Washington University. Lisa Logan, who you just heard there, is the manager of our Wage Center, and our work study students are also here behind the scenes, helping things run as smoothly as we hope they will. So before we start today, it's important for us to think about the land that we're on. Even though we're meeting in this virtual space that maybe is a little more comfortable than it was 7 months ago, we're all physically located on somebody's homelands. I want to encourage us, those of us especially who are not Indigenous, to acknowledge that we're on other people's lands and to find ways to support their self-determination. Eastern Washington University is situated on the traditional lands of the Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Kalispell, Nez Perce, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Indian Reservation, and the Yakama Nations. Due to pandemic relocation, I'm currently located in Oakland, California. This is Ohlone land, and I work to support Ohlone people and Indigenous campaigns here. So early this fall, like probably many of you, I started to get nervous about election chaos and aftermath. And I realized that whatever happened, and we're still in that moment of feeling like we're on the brink, we were going to want to have a space like this to think about the role that white supremacy has played in the election. I knew that folks in the Pacific Northwest were going to be particularly interested in impacts in the region. So I got a hold of some very smart scholar activists in the areas of white power, Indigenous and immigration studies, and they generously agreed to be part of this series. And so here we are now. I want to thank our co-sponsors. They include Africana, American Indian, and Chicanx Studies, and the College of Social Sciences at Eastern Washington University. And from the community, the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, or PJALS. So the plan for our time together is as follows. I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn, and then they're going to have 15 minutes to present to us. There's a lot more that could be said, but we're trying to be cognizant of time. Lisa's going to give them 3-minute warnings so we can stay on track. After their presentations, we're going to give the panelists time to engage with each other on what they're sharing today. And then we're going to open it up for your questions and should have about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes at the end, and then we're ending at 5:30. So to ask a question, the slide that's on the screen shows you that you just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in your question there. You can do that at any point during the webinar, and if your question is specific to a panelist, please indicate that so that we know I'll know where to direct it. We're going to do our best to get through as many questions as possible at the end of our time here. So that said, our first panelist is Dr. Joan Braun. Dr. Braun is a lecturer in philosophy at Gonzaga University and an affiliate of the Gonzaga Institute for Hate Studies. Her research stands at the intersection of the Frankfurt School of Frankfurt School Critical Theory and Critical Hate Studies. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, she has published 2 books and is currently working on a new book on fascism and how to fight it, clearly one that we need. Dr. Braun is also a community activist and a frequent invited speaker, helping community organizations understand and respond to the threat of white supremacist and fascist violence and bullying. Help me welcome Dr. Braun, although we can in virtual space, but thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm a philosopher, as Judy was saying, and over the past 4 years, I've focused more of my research on fascism and fascist movements, and of course, white supremacy intersects with that in the U.S. context. And on the other hand, also white supremacy is part of the structure and history of this country. When we think about slavery, colonization, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and so on, right? And many people have heard me in the local community speak about the different factions, the different organizations that exist among far-right and white nationalist and fascist movements in the Northwest. So I'll begin a little bit by talking about some of that, but what I really want to do today is broaden our thinking about our social categories around this. And I want to challenge one in particular. So oftentimes you'll hear about fascists, the far right, or white supremacist organizations as extremists. And I want to challenge this notion of extremism as the appropriate category for thinking about fascism and the far right. So I'll give several reasons why I think that's the case. And if I slip up and call them extremists myself, that's because it's such a wide part of my discipline. So I'm in philosophy, but I'm also in hate studies, which is an interdisciplinary field. And hate studies itself has problems, I would say. It's an extremely white field, and we could talk about some of the reasons why that is. And I think this category of extremism is part of the difficulty we're dealing with in this field. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So I live in Spokane, and people in this city and in the surrounding areas know that we have a problem here with organized white supremacy and militant and violent white supremacist organizations. There is a history to this. Organizations and individuals began moving into the Northwest deliberately to create a white homeland beginning in the 1980s. So you had movements often using terms like the Northwest Territorial Imperative. The idea was that this region was already so white for historical reasons. People of color were kept out of Oregon Territory. And that this could be a kind of white regional homeland. It was a separatist movement, essentially. You hear that term, Northwest Territorial Imperative, less now. Oftentimes you hear Great American Redoubt. And the Great American Redoubt is not always explicitly racist, but it draws energy and has connections to that historical white nationalist movement. In Spokane, over the past few years, we have dealt with so many organizations, it's astounding. We've dealt with the Proud Boys. We've dealt with Foyer Creek Division. We've dealt with Identity Europa, which renamed itself American Identity Movement. We've dealt with Patriot Front. We've dealt with Joey Gibson. We've dealt with the 14 First, a tiny new neo-Nazi organization, and a string of other organizations. There are incidents of flyering, of violence, of intimidation. And when these incidents occur, people have a certain historical memory in this region. So it doesn't simply happen out of context. They're aware, for example, that this is the same region that dealt with the Order, that dealt with the Aryan Nations, where the Spokesman Review newspaper was bombed, where Planned Parenthood was bombed, where more recently the Martin Luther King March was very nearly bombed. We live not far from the historical site of Ruby Ridge. So there is a keen sense in this community that fascist, white nationalist, white supremacist organizations and far-right organizations pose a violent threat. And that threat is real. But I think the emphasis on viewing fascism and the far-right and white supremacist organizations as extremists, as violent, and as fitting a certain image, having swastika tattoos, riding motorcycles, sig heiling, being aggressive. leads us to a certain kind of confusion about what fascism and white nationalism and white supremacy can look like. One of the problems with theorizing fascism as extremism is that it leads us to predict something weird. We expect white nationalists to look like criminals, cult members, biker gangs. We expect them to be tattooed and threatening. We don't expect them to look like the boy next door or the girl next door. That's a problem, for one thing, because there's been a systematic attempt at normalization, at cleaning up, entering police forces, entering the Republican Party, entering mainstream political organizations. If you look at Identity Europa, for example, which recently disbanded, partially because it's pursuing an even further degree of normalization, and announced that it disbanded the day before the presidential election. James Alsup has been very prominent in that group here in Spokane. He was elected to a precinct committee position in Whitman County, and then shortly after did some entryist stuff into the local GOP, and was a speaker at a GOP, an event that was organized by the local chair of the Republican Party. When that was exposed, his entryism was sort of stopped. But his mindset, and he spoke about this at, I think, American Renaissance, is that white racists are normal, right? And when you say things like, I'm afraid of the foreigners, or we need to build a wall, those are both white supremacist statements and normal. And so he tried to craft a message that was normal, but that would also be a deliberate attempt to recruit people into the far right and into a fascist movement. And this has been going on since the 80s and back. White nationalist groups have always been doing this. The use of humor, for example, is also a way that this occurs, a way of sort of lowering defenses, seeming more normal. We're not completely serious, we're just joking. But it's a deliberate tactic to desensitize and recruit. So one reason we don't want to think about them as extremists is because we don't want to assume that they're not going to seem normal. It also lets mainstream structures off the hook to assume that fascists are extremists. So we start thinking about white supremacy as something weird over there that we gawk at, that we have maybe reality television shows about, not something that expresses itself in our country's history and in US imperialism and mass incarceration and redlining and immigration policy and on and on and on, police brutality, etc. We also see that mainstream political structures very easily accommodate white nationalists and fascists. We've seen that locally. You can see cleaned up white supremacists and fascists going to Washington Policy Center events funded by the Koch brothers to hear Nigel Farage speak or to hear Charlie Kirk speak. You can see them hanging around State Rep Matt Shea, who now has a church in Spokane. You can see it in the leadership of the Republican Party in Coeur d'Alene, who issued a statement asking the State Department to allow Martin Sellner, who was under a travel ban due to his potential ties to the mosque shooter who killed 50-some Muslims in New Zealand, asking that his travel ban be lifted so that he could marry alt-right pundit Brittany Pettibone, who lives in Coeur d'Alene or lived in Coeur d'Alene, at the Davenport Hotel. So we see it in mainstream structures and in mainstream institutions. The language of extremism also lumps the left and the right together, and it paints the left and the right as identical, a both sides kind of problem. So on the one hand, you have white nationalists, on the other hand, you have, say, Antifa or Black Lives Matter, and these are painted as identical. What this enables, for one thing as well, is a state crackdown. So the same pots of money that go to think tanks devoted to undermining white nationalist groups by doing, say, counter narratives on the internet designed to keep people from joining hate groups. Those same pots of money are going to police departments to surveil Muslims, to surveil Black Lives Matter, to investigate leftist activists, to keep an eye on refugees that seem suspicious. So it creates this narrative where these two things are seen as the same. But the left and the right are not the same, because the far right is fighting for oppression, is fighting for hierarchy, is fighting for a worldview according to which violence and power determine right. And the left is fighting for human emancipation. But these two are kind of painted in the same light. Closely connected as well, I've touched on this, but the language of extremism is very closely tied to Islamophobia. And because Muslims have been painted as extremists, the language that fascists are extremists plays into Islamophobia. For example, one of the theories you'll hear the most from sort of moderate, centrist, or conservative critics of the far right is you'll hear this term cumulative extremism. It's a term from this guy, Roger Eatwell, in Britain. The idea of cumulative extremism is that if you have more extremist movements in society, they will amplify each other. So they will compete and they will grow by painting one another as the enemy and by increasing intense feelings and intense political positions. What that means then is that the researcher, the hate studies researcher, or the countering extremism researcher positions themselves as a centrist whose job it is to tamp down on all of these different things. And one of those different things is like Islam in the abstract very often. And when you think, for example, about how this changes our theorization about these issues, you know, there are people who have left Islamophobic hate groups who have now identified themselves as counter-extremism experts. And their narrative has hardly changed because of this idea of cumulative extremism. So their original narrative was, I am in an Islamophobic hate group because Muslims are extremists, right? And now their narrative is, I am in countering extremism, countering hate groups, countering ISIS, countering these other things, because now I see that not all Muslims are like that, but some of them are extremists, and that was causing me to be an extremist myself. The problem with that is that kind of rhetoric would never be tolerated against, say, Jews, right? I'm half Jewish. Like if anybody in the hate studies field said, for example, that anti-Semitism is caused by certain Jews being extremist, that would never fly because people would say, oh, that's victim blaming. You can't do that, right? But you can do it with Islam. You can do it with Muslims. So I see that as a really very deep problem in the field. And the last reason why I think we need to think that fascism is more than just extremism or not theorize it as extremism is that it paints fascism.
You have 3 minutes.
Perfect. Is it paints fascism as a crime problem. And fascism is not essentially a crime problem. It's a social movement seeking power, always already connected to sources of power. If we think about fascism as a crime problem, then we're going to look to the same police that we are criticizing when we're standing with Black Lives Matter to save us from fascism. We're going to look to the state, perhaps Trump's own DHS, for example, to save us from fascism. And these institutions that present themselves as normal and outside of extremism are tied to people like Stephen Miller, who's an outright white nationalist and part of the Trump administration. So when I think about how, for example, the Spokane County Sheriff, Sheriff Ozzie, speaks about these things. Sheriff Ozzie's been here a long time. He's seen the period of the Aryan nations, and now he sees Antifa, and he's like, this is probably the same thing, right? He's like, both of these things seem extreme to me. And so what happens is, you know, the co-chair of our Democratic Socialists of America chapter shows up at a Black Lives Matter rally this summer, gets arrested in a targeted political arrest by our sheriff, and gets accused of, you know, just in terms of some warrant that he had from 2013 that no one had contacted him about, no one had warned him about, and then gets ushered into some room where some sort of set of federal agents want to talk to him and he refuses to speak to them. But the mentality, you know, that we're going to apply this same investigation to both sides, to both of the extremes, in fact creates an outcome that's very beneficial to fascism. It creates a crackdown on the left. And so I really think we need to break out of this paradigm. And it's true that fascism is, it's true that being James Alsop is not the same as being an average moderate Republican. There are differences in ideology. But fascism is always already connected to sources of power. It's connected to the mainstream in ways that we don't like to look at and don't like to admit. And the longer we see it as isolated and strange and over there, the less effectively we can fight it, because we're not going to recognize it when it shows up. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Joan, for that. So much in there. Okay, so our next panelist is Dr. Joe, oh no, now I'm gonna get this wrong. Lowndes. Is that right, Joe?
That's right. Yep, you got it.
Yay. Okay. Dr. Lowndes is a professor of political science at the University of Oregon. He's done extensive research on right-wing politics, race, populism, social movements, and US political development. Most recently, he is the co-author of the book titled Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race, and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. That book explores the complex racial politics of the contemporary US right, from the militia movement to the alt-right to the mainstream Republican Party. Dr. Lowndes engages in a public audience through popular scholarship and interviews with media outlets, including National Public Radio, MSNBC, CBS Radio, ABC Radio, and others. So thank you so much, Dr. Lowndes, for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, and thanks for inviting me to be here. And it's great to be here with both Professor Braun and the great Northwest journalist, Jason Wilson. And also thanks to Eastern Washington University for sponsoring this and the different groups within that did it. And Lisa Logan and other people who are now behind the scenes coordinating this. I'm in Eugene, Oregon right now, where the University of Oregon is. I'm in my office, no one else is around. We are on Kalapuya land historically, and I want to acknowledge that before beginning my remarks. I'm going to try to share a screen here. And if it works, then we're in good shape. If not, then yes, I think we're in good shape. To talk about what I want to talk about here today. I thought what might be useful for us, since it's an election right now that we're in the midst of, is to really look at the relationship of the far right, the fascist right, the white nationalist right, to the Republican Party. And I think this is it's a story that it's developmental, it has changed over time. And so what I'm going to try to do, squashed into 15 minutes or less, is to kind of draw out an arc of that relationship over time, and then think a little bit about what this means for us today and going forward. Okay, so, as we know, we've seen with the election of Donald Trump, or even the campaign of Donald Trump in 2016, the rise of far-right groups, from white supremacist, white nationalist groups to kind of proto-fascist street groups, to kind of most recently kind of a reigniting of paramilitary groups, or the Patriot movement. But one of the things about where we are right now is that these movements are all increasingly tied to the Republican Party itself. It's in ways that are disturbing, but also make the Republican Party into kind of a new entity that looks these days much more like maybe a Central European far-right party than it would a kind of a big tent coalition of conservative groups in the US, the way that it has been. But far-right, for reasons of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and forms of Christian nationalism, have played a role in the Republican Party, and a growing role over time. So I want to talk a little bit about how I see that dynamic and where that leaves us. One of the things I want to say is that I think that the relationship between the far right and the Republican Party begins in the mid-1960s. And it is in some ways a response to two things. First one and then the other. First is the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century and the associated movements that went along with it. This would be also Chicano freedom struggles, Puerto Rican freedom struggles, Asian American freedom struggles, LGBT struggles, second wave feminism, and the anti-war movement, kind of anti-imperialism more broadly. All these were triggered by the civil rights revolution, and all of them kind of, in some ways, permanently transformed the ground of U.S. politics in ways that I think we are still in the midst of, and in the midst of maybe in new ways right now. The second one is the long-term growth of economic inequality since the mid-20th century, which is now more exaggerated than it has been since the late 19th century. So, as I said, the Black freedom struggle or the civil rights revolution of the 1950s and 60s, while it was partially defeated or beaten back, it fundamentally challenged the ideological assumptions of white political and social rule in the United States in ways that are permanent or semi-permanent. It forced changes in law and policy around education, employment, and housing. It led to the end of the national quota system of immigration that had been in place since 1924, and that comes to matter by the time we get to the 1990s. The other piece of it is is economic inequality. The rise of the right and the renewed strength of the Republican Party after the 1960s meant that its economic conservative wing, kind of the anti-tax, anti-regulation, anti-labor, and upward transfer of wealth part of the party, became increasingly strong and oriented towards greater economic inequality. What today, a fancy term we might use is neoliberalism. But what's given us is extraordinary gaps in wealth, which again we haven't seen since the Gilded Age of the 19th century, a time of vast fortunes at the very top and various forms of inequality down to abject immiseration at the bottom, which is why scholars sometimes call this the new Gilded Age that we're in. So I think within the Republican Party, also known as the Grand Old Party, or GOP, there's been continuing tension between this party being the party of the rich or a business and being the defender of white racial interests. And I think that the tensions between these two have been essentially a productive tension on the right, which have developed the far right over time. And I think it happens in almost a kind of a cyclical pattern, but one that has over time strengthened the hand of the far right in the Republican Party. So there's four moments that I'm going to just hit on very briefly, which I think show this development over time. The first is the 1968 election, which had Hubert Humphrey as a Democratic candidate, George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, as a third-party candidate, and then Richard Nixon as a Republican candidate. I'm going to start with that one. So Wallace's third-party campaign, it's important for us mostly because it was extraordinarily influential on the Republican Party, on the Republican platform, and on the Republican voter base. Richard Nixon, the winner in 1968, really drew on themes from the Wallace campaign and elements of it in ways that make Wallace kind of a proto-Republican figure. In his campaign, in order to get on the ballot in 50 states, he had to work with a range of groups. Robert Shelton's United Klans of America, which had 30,000 members and maybe another 250,000 supporters and followers around the country. Smaller groups like here on the right, this is Anthony Imperiali, who after the Newark riots in 1967 organized a self-defense squad, they called it, of kind of white martial artists and rifle wielders who went out after black activists. He then had a career in Republican politics and also has a career in vote suppression. Also other groups like the Minutemen, who are a 1960s era kind of political gang tied to extreme anti-communism and kind of like a even crazier outgrowth of the John Birch Society. But Wallace used those groups to get on the ballot. But even so, even when Wallace was working with them, the campaign made sure that that was never public. It was too far, these were too far outside, even for the Wallace campaign, to have any kind of public association with these groups. It was always kept quiet. Wallace pushed Nixon rightward in '68, getting Nixon to embrace a racist populism, comes out strongly against busing, calls for law and order, appeals to what he now calls the silent majority, and works to win over working class white voters and working class white ethnics in particular. After Watergate in the mid '70s, Nixon is forced to resign, and conservative and populist right-wing activists begin to be disenchanted with the Republican Party, seeing it as too business oriented, and so start to look around for a new kind of populist party that can replace it. The old publisher of the National Review, a guy named Bill Rusher, Pat Buchanan, Richard Viguerie, and other kind of figures who would become part of the new right, cast around for a party in the 1970s that would be kind of using the vehicle of George Wallace's old party, tried to pull in, tried to link the far right and the conservative right. They approached both George Wallace and Ronald Reagan, both of whom considered running as third-party candidates in 1976. Reagan ended up running in the Republican primaries against Ford. George Wallace ended up going back to the Democratic Party and releasing his delegates to Jimmy Carter that year. But out of that moment, which included former Wallaceites and Klan members and parts of what became a more militant far right, an emergent new right kind of worked its way into the system and was able to draft Reagan, who was considered a very arch conservative at the time, to be the Republican candidate in 1980. So this moved the far, kind of a very arch conservative position into the center of the Republican Party. And there's a lot to say about Reagan in relation to that. After 12 years in power, Reagan and then Bush the father, the GOP kind of consolidated rule in Washington, had wealthy lobbies and foundations, had kind of a neoconservative orientation to governing. This was not a hard conservatism, but kind of a business conservatism, which had kind of what we might call a statist orientation. As a result of that, a lot of kind of populists and people on the far right or the right wing of the party became restless. And by 1992, George H.W. Bush met primary challengers. First, David Duke, the former Klan Grand Dragon from Louisiana, who had run as a Republican and successfully for a state house seat in Louisiana, then ran for governor in 1991, almost winning that year. And then he joins the 1992 primaries, which freaks out the establishment, except for one person who had been Reagan's communications director and had been a speechwriter for Nixon. This was Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan said, "Look, don't worry about Duke. The way you deal with Duke is the way we dealt with Wallace. You find all of his issues which work with Republican issues and take them over and reach out to that base." He soon took his own advice and jumped into the primaries himself, taking much of David Duke's rhetoric and many of David Duke's organizers and supporters with him. He ran against what Bush was calling the New World Order, the post-Cold War order. He ran against free trade, affirmative action, gay rights, abortion, and importantly, immigration, which was going to become an important aspect of far-right populist politics beginning in the 1990s. There had been elements of it floating around the 80s and the 70s, but the changes in immigration law from the 1960s had now added many more non-white people in the U.S. in ways that the Ku Klux Klan starts organizing around. David Duke was one of the first people calling for a border wall and doing he did these Klan border watches where they would patrol the U.S.-Mexican border. Many other right-wing groups would do it later. Pat Buchanan takes up most of those issues in ways that are startlingly racist, even to the Republican Party.
Joe, you
Yeah.
have 3 minutes.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to jump right ahead because I just want to say quickly, Buchanan is able to influence the party in a second wave. And then the next one is what we call Tea Party to Trump. The Tea Party movement pulls in more people from the outside. Trump is able to use both racial animus and economic anxiety to pull together a coalition of the far right. I briefly want to say just one thing quickly is that there was the alt-right which came up, which Joan has talked about a little bit, of these far right groups, racist groups, had kind of a rise and fall momentarily, and I think they've been replaced by a militia movement, a patriot movement, which has much more, which sees itself as kind of civic nationalist, even though it's racist, which allows it to kind of go under the radar. I think the Black Lives Matter protests and the pandemic have been the things that have launched the patriot movement into such prominence now, even around this election. And I think there's more, we can talk about a lot of this in Q&A, but we now see these election protests, like in Phoenix last night. They're a little bit disorganized, and it's hard to see what's going to happen with them. But groups like Ammon Bundy has been calling for, he has a new group called the People's Rights Network, which has been calling for a civil war after November 4. And I think that the kind of punchline here is that Trump may go away, or Trump may, it looks like he's going to be defeated, but Trumpism still owns the Republican Party, and Trump will be a kingmaker in that party, and we can talk about why, but there is, this will be a powerful force, and it has fused the far right with the Republican right in ways that we're deeply stuck with. And nationally, like in the Pacific Northwest, different elements have now merged: paramilitary groups, QAnon conspiracy supporters, Blue Lives Matter, pro-cop groups like Cops Northwest here, Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, kind of street fascists, and the Republican Party itself. So I'm just going to stop there, having rushed through quickly, and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. That sets us up really well for Q&A too. So I appreciate that. And it's fantastic to have speakers who are cognizant of time schedules. So thank you all for being really mindful of that, so that we can get to the Q&A. Final panelist today is Jason Wilson. Jason is an independent investigative journalist based in Portland, Oregon. He is mostly published in the Guardian newspaper, but has also written for the Southern Poverty Law Center, Billingcat, and other outlets. He specializes in investigating the far right, and previously he taught journalism at universities in his native Australia. So thanks for being with us today, Jason.
Thanks. I just had to unmute myself there. Thank you indeed, Judy, and thanks to you, you and Lisa, and to UEW for having us along, and thanks also to Joan and Joe, who I'm really happy to be sharing a platform with. I am at my house in Washington County, on the outskirts of Portland. So yes, I'm also on Kalapuya land, and I'd like to acknowledge their ownership of the land. So I have been in this country for, oh boy, since 2013, I guess. So 7, going on for 8 years. And for most of that time, I've been, reporting on what seemed to me to be, from almost the moment I arrived, what seemed to be a kind of upsurge in far right groups, movements, actors of all kinds. Initially I was seeing that online, and then, I was seeing it on the ground as I reported out those stories here, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. Although, I have been, I have reported on incidents elsewhere. I covered Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville for The Guardian, and various other things around the place. I think you've had some great theoretical kind of and definitional insights from Joan, and Joe's, I think, as usual, given a really deft sort of historical overview. I guess what I'm going to talk about briefly is, the way in which the right operates in the Pacific Northwest, and also the pull that the Pacific Northwest exerts even now on the imagination of the far right, far right groups of various kinds. And I've got a handout with more detailed information. I'm just going to go over that in brief, but you can read some more later, and I've got some references and stuff there that you can follow up yourself. But yeah, I mean, right now, as has been the case for some time, the far right sees the Pacific Northwest as a kind of land of opportunity for a number of interrelated reasons. So they think that they can recruit and act more freely in this region because, for one thing, it's unusually white compared to other regions of the country for historical reasons, including, racial exclusion laws, both at the founding, excluding people of color from Oregon, for example, but also later on, because of anti-Asian right-wing populist movements in the late 19th century, there were racial exclusion laws passed, which, applied to the whole country. So there's that. There's a kind of, we know this, that there's a kind of, there's an ingrained conservatism in rural parts of the Pacific Northwest. There's also, a kind of economic decline. Joe talked about that at a kind of national level, but there's a particular issue of economic decline in rural areas in the Pacific Northwest, basically due to, the kind of slow decline of the timber, the forestry timber industry. And for various reasons, and we can get into this, maybe in Q&A, but right now there's the barrier, that whatever barrier existed between, mainstream conservatism and the far right is incredibly porous now. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that Republicans are pretty much locked out of statewide power in both Washington and Oregon. And then Idaho is, a different case, but in various states, for various reasons, that barrier has become porous. But also, there are specific visions of the Pacific Northwest as a place where, separatist projects could be carried out. Jonah already mentioned the Northwest Territorial Imperative. I won't dwell on that for that reason, but I did want to give a couple of examples, of individuals and groups that I've actually reported on, and just to sort of exemplify how the right operates in the Pacific Northwest, the far right operates, and how they think about the Pacific Northwest. And the two examples I'm going to talk about are Representative Matt Shea and the members and the accelerationist neo-Nazi group, the Base. And I'm not saying, by the way, just in case Representative Shea is watching the live stream, I'm not saying that that those two groups are exactly the same and that they line up ideologically, and that I'm not going to fall into the trap, as Joan says, of saying that one's more extreme than the other, but they definitely are different. There are overlaps, but they're not. Basically, let's say that Representative Shea represents a much more system loyal form of right-wing populism than the Base does, who are absolutely insurrectionary. So right-wing populism is a useful way I found to think about this stuff. I'm suspicious of the extremism framework as well. I'm kind of also, as a reporter, I'm also keen to kind of avoid, bickering over kind of contentious labels. So in my own work, I tend to focus on what people do, on their words and their deeds, and, to just kind of like leave aside labels that people might dispute. Although I'm happy to quote others calling people fascists. And it's not that I'm not prepared to apply labels when they're necessary, but I think right-wing populism, as it's laid out in Chip Delay and Matthew Lyons' book from 2000, Right-Wing Populism in America, it's useful, and the details are there in the handout, but the thing that has really been productive for me to think about is that, you know, the characteristics, I guess, that they spell out, or the habits of thought of right-wing populists that they spell out, which you find amongst neo-Nazis as much as you do amongst, you know, less outre forms of right-wing populism. And that's producerism, you know, demonization and scapegoating, particularly of disfavored elites, conspiracism, so conspiracy thinking, and kind of millennialism, a sort of apocalyptic or millennialist narrative that they're inhabiting. So really, there have been waves of right-wing populism that have kind of washed across the Pacific Northwest ever since white settlement. And I think that right-wing populism, I come from Australia, you might be able to tell that I have a kind of an accent from there, but and Australia is very similar. And, you know, I haven't quite nailed this down yet, but I kind of think I've been thinking about right-wing populism as a kind of settler ideology in a lot of ways, because it's about maintaining the kind of privilege that settlement brought to a particular stratum of white people, even if it didn't deliver them the power that those at the top of the society have. So the other thing that Berlin lines say about right-wing populism is that it's right-wing populism as such is they say it's a subset of repressive populism. I won't get into those details, but it's motivated or defined centrally by a backlash against liberation movement, social reform, or revolution. And I think that backlash has been kind of overdetermined almost in the last decade or so. So, you know, the election of a non-white president was something that seemed to really set things alight. I wasn't in the country at that time, but obviously I can see the lasting impact of the Tea Party movement, the birther movement, which really, you know, launched Donald Trump as a kind of political contender. All of the kind of conspiracy thinking that came about as a result of this kind of shock, I think, for a lot of white Americans in seeing a non-white president elected. The Black Lives Matter movement as well, from 2013 on, is something that white supremacists, white nationalists, right down to you know, Bircher types like Representative Shea have told me to my face is something that has kind of motivated their activism. You know, there was immigration, but there was also a particular moment where there were a lot of refugees as a result of conflicts in the Middle East, the Syrian civil war, etc. And so there were more refugees both in Europe and the United States. And this is a very transnational kind of moment for these tendencies. So things that are happening in Europe feed into the discourse in the United States and vice versa. But yeah, refugee resettlement also led to a kind of, you know, an intolerant and kind of angry response. One thing that I think has been underestimated in analysis of perennially underestimated in analysis of the 2016 result, or perhaps I'm just reading the wrong stuff, was, you know, the decision on the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage. I was at the Western Conservative Summit, which is a you know, a Christian right type annual conference, the day that decision was handed down. And those people, I mean, it hit them like, it had a huge impact on them. And I think from that moment on, the evangelical Christian right was mobilizing to vote in 2016. I think also there's been more militant left-wing organizing that these movements have reacted to, whether it's, you know, the Bernie Sanders campaign or the DSA or Antifa is the kind of the boogeyman now. That's also led to a kind of response, and all of this has been involved with a surging kind of conspiracy thinking that, you know, there's a short route from conspiracy thinking to anti-Semitism, and so we've seen a huge kind of re-entry of kind of explicit anti-Semitism into political discourse. So, and that's not obviously none of that is to say that the reaction to this is the fault of anyone in these movements, or that that somehow the people who are involved in these struggles are responsible for the backlash they've received. It's just, I think, part of the context. So I want to talk about my first example, Representative Matt Shea, who I've done a lot of reporting on. Some of you folks will probably be aware of Representative Shea. He's a 5-term representative for the 4th District, Washington State's 4th House District. Because of the reporting that journalists, including me, I guess, have done, the State House commissioned a report which found that he had engaged, among other things, that he'd engaged in acts of domestic terrorism because of his involvement with the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge
Jason,
occupation.
you have 3 minutes, Jason.
Okay. So, he, in many ways, has acted as a kind of a bridge or a nexus between a whole range of far-right populist groups, from the John Birch Society to Ammon Bundy to John Guandolo to the Covenant Church, where he's now a pastor. He's not seeking re-election. He is he's really big on conspiracy thinking and conspiracy rhetoric. So he kind of posits that radical Islamists and the left are in league to kind of subvert the United States. I call him a kind of neo-Bircher. But to cut to the chase, not Rob Chase, his ally, who's now been elected in his place, but the other Chase. He's also involved in a kind of separatist project in the Pacific Northwest, where he wants a separate state to be carved out of Eastern Washington, Liberty State. And it's curious to me that he imagines that as a kind of home for his brand of politics, where people like him will simply not be disturbed by, the liberals in Seattle, who he scapegoats relentlessly for all of the problems that people encounter in his area. I want to talk about the base as well, just quickly. So the base is a neo-Nazi accelerationist group, or was. I think it's probably pretty much defunct now. It was founded by a guy called Ronaldo Nazzaro, who actually grew up in New Jersey, but who bought a patch of 30 acres off-grid land in Ferry County, just kind of northwest of Republic. And they were going to have a training meetup at that land in August 2019, but the details of that were kind of leaked by an anti-fascist group, and that got called off. But he still owns the land. I checked just yesterday. He's living in Russia now, and I'm not certain whether he's going to be able to return without answering some questions. But when he cropped up on the far right scene, he distinguished himself from other accelerationists by kind of pushing this idea of the Northwest political imperative. So he presented himself as a kind of disciple of Harold Covington, who's a guy who lived in Bremerton, Washington for many years, and who really pushed this idea that the Pacific Northwest should be a white ethno-state. And that was also the idea that Nazzaro, as the founder of the base, was pushing, that the Pacific Northwest could and should be a different country that exclusively inhabited by white people. I've got some details of Covington's kind of line of thinking in there. He was, as an accelerationist, Nazzaro was also influenced by James Mason, a neo-Nazi who wrote a newsletter which has been compiled as a book called Siege, which is the kind of Bible of neo-Nazi accelerationism, who, basically urged people to commit acts of terrorism in order to destabilize liberal democracy, so that white ethno-state could be kind of built on the ruins, so to speak.
Your time is up.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm done anyway. We can go through more details and questions if people want to.
I'm sure people will want to. Jason, thank you so much for that. So we have some time now for the three of you to engage with each other and sort of follow up on some of the ties that are threaded through what the three of you have presented to us tonight. So, so I just want to open it up to you all to ask questions or make comments or help us see what you're sharing in sort of a broader context.
I was wondering if I could ask Joan something. So like, how is that? I mean, people really, there seems to be a real intuitive appeal to that kind of extremist framework. I've just noticed in talking to just folks, ordinary folks, you know, whether or not they're particularly engaged with this stuff. I mean, do you encounter resistance to the idea that, you know, there is this kind of symmetrical kind of space and the far left's just as bad as the far right? I mean, do people kind of resist that idea in your experience?
Do people resist the idea that the far right and the far left are
yeah, that the extremist model is not adequate. I mean, it just seems in my conversations that it has a real intuitive appeal for people, and they find it hard to let it go.
I mean, you know, a lot of what I do has been talking to kind of liberal white audiences in the Northwest and kind of explaining what these different groups are. And, you know, if you see these symbols, you know, plastered in your neighborhood, you know, what does this mean? And the idea of viewing everything through the lens of extremism is very attractive and very intuitive for a lot of people. But I'm also around a lot of leftist activists who are already trained to be suspicious of, you know, both sides saying things. I honestly, I think the best work critiquing this is being done by people who are Muslim or working on, you know, critiquing, countering violent extremism programs in Europe and stuff like that. Like Arun Kunnandi, I've actually got his book sitting here, The Muslims Are Coming. It's done great work on this. And there's a new book out, Reactionary Democracy, by Aaron Winter and Arlene Mondon, that deals with this. Europe's Fault Lines by Liz Fakit. So I feel like the critique is starting to happen, but I also feel like what worries me more is the way that academic researchers like me are reinforcing it too. Because it's like, it's fine if like people aren't familiar with the issues and they've just been taught to view it that way, but like, where are they getting that idea too? Because they're getting it from institutions. And yeah.
Just to add to that, as someone who has also reported on the Blue Leaks archive, which is a big leak of from a fusion center that happened in June. So, sorry, I was just checking I hadn't muted myself again. You know, law enforcement is also really into that idea as well, the idea of the kind of extremist framework. And I just kind of wonder if that's ultimately where it comes from, or if that's the constituency it's kind of serving ultimately. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've also seen people on the far right say they're fighting extremism. It'll be interesting. We could look at some of the same stuff and see, like, has Matt Shea talked about, you know, fighting extremism? There's like a Southern Poverty Law Center listed hate group, Clarion Project, which is an Islamophobic hate group. And they claim they're like a think tank that fights extremism. So it's like, it crosses over.
You know, I think part of it has like broader, kind of in the US anyway, this kind of post World War II and Cold War kind of sense of kind of a consensus against both, you know, Soviet Union and Soviet satellite states on the one hand, and the experience fighting Nazism in Europe on the other. And so what held the US together was this idea of a consensus, kind of liberal capitalist democracy against those extremes. But I think partly with the end of the Cold War, the right, I think, understood quickly what was at stake and where things were headed. And as that consensus unraveled, there's no longer anything to kind of hold together. Clearly, the mainstream political parties are no longer held together by any kind of like ideological consensus. And so I think the right took that out much more quickly and ran with it. And the left is only now kind of figuring out, like, or progressives are beginning to figure out that they're, you know, clinging to institutions. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff, even around anti-Trumpism, you know, all these scholars like Yascha Mounk or, you know, Timothy Snyder or whoever else, they all talk about populism as extremism or authoritarianism always, or defending the Constitution against these, extremes on the right and left. And there's a way in which it's always it's defending, I mean, it's the constitutional order that put Trump into power to begin with. So defending the Constitution and defending anti-democratic institutions in the U.S., like the Supreme Court or the Senate, are kind of like always stick us politically in a place that's not useful either. So I think a lot, I come across that same thing among academics as well, as this kind of like desire to go back and hold on to a center which was never good to begin with, but now seems increasingly untenable as a way of approaching politics. Seems like I think it's maybe undergoing change, as you say, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the media as well, I've seen a big change over the past few years. Both, it used to be kind of a lot harder to even get editors to agree that this was something worth paying attention to, and thankfully that is no longer the case. But also, there's a preparedness now to call things for what they are, to really accept that a lot of the time people from these movements are acting in bad faith, to kind of shape their coverage or just to, receive the kind of coverage that they want. There is a kind of relaxation also of the idea that, that these are somehow just more or less the same as some other kind of legitimate political actor. I think that there has been some positive changes there. There's kind of, people will sort of make mistakes now and again, and things aren't perfect. But I feel like that all of that has come a long way just over the last 4 years. I mean, maybe too late, I'm not sure, but I feel like things, like you, I feel like things are changing.
I kind of related to that. I had a question for Joe, because it kind of sounded like you were saying that the alt-right has sort of been replaced in some ways by the Patriot movement. And I think there's truth in that, but I'm also curious, like, because I think white nationalism has also been much more normalized in public. So do you see white nationalism as getting swallowed by the fact that there are these multiracial far-right groups, or are you still seeing, when you look at the Proud Boys, are you still seeing like the defense of a white ethno-state like happening within that?
Well, I think, part of it is that, I think even the kind of the multicultural far right now, or the, so if you go to like the 3%ers website under About, the first thing you'll see is a denunciation of white supremacy. That's the first thing, all in caps. Same with the Oath Keepers. You go to their website, the first thing you see is we come in all colors. It's like they really like push that line hard. And obviously we know the Proud Boys do, and other elements of, of these movements, or Ammon Bundy, who was like going to speak at a Black Lives Matter protest and then told that he couldn't. There's white supremacy underlying even all these groups as well, but it's rearticulated in a language of civic nationalism as opposed to racial nationalism, which which makes them more dangerous. If you think about, for instance, like the way that Dylan Roof was understood when he, when he killed 9 Black people in a church in Charleston, he was seen as this kind of like creepy ghoul of a guy with his Rhodesian flags and Confederate insignia. But then you look at Kyle Rittenhouse. This guy guns down 2 Black Lives Matter protesters, and they show pictures of him scrubbing graffiti and looking like a Boy Scout. And but partly it's because there can be a language there around him fighting extremism, fighting communism, fighting these kinds of conspiratorial movements, and not as defending publicly the idea of a white ethno-state. And that makes these movements has made them much more amenable to be mass movements, mass social movements, and not small cells or small groups in the same way. I think in the Pacific Northwest in the deep Southeast, in the Pacific Northwest, you get more like clear white nationalism. But I think more broadly, these other movements have grown, even though they're in response to Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, that's what put tens of thousands of these patriots on the streets all summer, armed to the teeth. and over 800 attacks on Black Lives Matter protesters and 5 killings. But it's done with a different kind of, with a much more American, pro-nationalist, and pro-Trump. The other thing about these white nationalist groups is they were never system loyal, as the term that Jason used earlier, in a way. When Jason and I were at an American Renaissance meeting in 2017, was that when it was?
Yeah.
In Tennessee, they were like, they're critical of Trump. They gave him I think, Peter Brimelow gave him a C or something. And they were not like that. Trump was like a vehicle for them, but he's not their guy. With the Patriot movement, they're Trumpists. They're openly Trumpists. They're openly, committed to now the Republican Party. So there's something that's shifted on the landscape here, and which is not to say that white nationalism falls out, but I think it's rearticulated in a way that makes it potentially more dangerous in a broad way.
I
could be a 3%er, but he wouldn't put up a Nazi flag in the same way,
But I think that's why also, I mean, some of the stuff on race is clearly disingenuous, and I mean, they're all of these groups pretty much are anti-immigrant and Islamophobic, and we can get into all of that, but yeah, they do disavow, the Patriot movement groups do disavow specifically, anti-Black racism or various other things that are just seen as beyond the pale, mostly in kind of formal politics. But that's why I think, I mean, that doesn't mean that they're not proto-fascist, right? Because they've just substituted a different kind of national enemy, which is the left mostly. Yeah, that's all. I mean, I just think, I think they're much more, to the extent that what you say is right. I think that that it is more amenable to a mass movement. They're extremely dangerous because of the impunity that Republicans are prepared to extend to them, to people like Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, hopefully he'll go to trial, and that will be a fair trial and all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think that if conservative media and lots of Republicans had their way, he wouldn't go to trial. I mean, he'd be out right now. And that kind of impunity also plays out in the streets of Portland, regularly. That far right actors just don't receive any consequences for
2 minutes left.
Yeah.
There are 2 minutes left in this section.
Anyway, that's just by way of adding to what you said, Joe, I think.
Yeah, Jason, I also think you're right in what you were saying earlier. I think it was you talking about the porous borders. Because I think both of those things are, I think Joe's right that there has been this shift, that there is a growth of the militia movement. I also think that there are people in those groups that do have the swastika flag hanging up over their bed in their private space, and so it's like, there's this open door between mainstream conservatism and the far right. And I'm thinking, for example, like we just saw the election of this 25-year-old Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina, who not that long ago, like, photographed himself at Hitler's retreat and said, this is on my bucket list. And now this guy's in Congress. So, I think we're seeing a normalization of white nationalism, a sort of open white nationalism within the Republican Party too. But I see both those things happening.
Can I say one more quick thing about this? I think partly what allows this broader kind of far right nationalism is also gender is fundamental to this, and masculinist violence and glory, and the incel movement, and kind of like anti-democracy. These are anti-democratic, authoritarian, and certainly anti-left forces. And so it's not, if the problem, I think sometimes liberals love to just to say white supremacists or white nationalists because there's a kind of a moral charge to that. But really we have to see these as as far right in a broader sense, with other kinds of demonization which are just as important. A lot of these mass killings that have happened, maybe over half of them in the last 10 years have been incel killings, So, and that masculinity provides a bridge, like, for the Proud Boys and other people to bring it to recruit non-white members on that basis.
The time is up for this section.
Wow, look at that. Thank you all. And thanks, Joe, for bringing in gender analysis. I obviously very much appreciate that. So some of the questions that were in the chat, you all have already had discussions around, but there's one, Joan, for you that we haven't talked about this yet. So it's Dr. Brown, could you address how we explain to our conservative family members that Antifa is not a hate or violent group? How do we battle the Fox/Trump administration's narration of leftist groups?
Sure. So Antifa is just short for anti-fascist, and it's a set of tactics. It's not an organization. So there are a number of organizations that are anti-fascist organizations, but you don't have to belong to one of those organizations to be anti-fascist. It tends to see platforming of fascists, giving spaces to fascists, giving voice to fascists as dangerous. So the idea is to not let fascists claim more space. So part of that does include sometimes physical confrontations by some anti-fascist groups. And you can see, you might tell your conservative relatives, for example, at Charlottesville, that the clergy people who were there at Charlottesville said that their lives were in danger and that anti-fascists saved their lives by forming a barrier. But most of what anti-fascists do actually isn't street violence or street confrontation, it's research. It's exposing fascists in power, showing who they are, what they're up to, helping people stay safe by knowing where these people are, getting them out of positions of influence. And then also you can look at issues with like mutual aid, like, a lot of the people that went out and helped with the forest fires over the recent period were involved in anti-fascist groups. So anti-fascist groups are, in the media, they're seen as, in the mainstream media as confrontational in the streets, but like, I kind of think of them as the people that like bring the snacks. So if that helps.
Thanks, Joan. Yes, that helps a lot. So this one says, first of all, thank you so much. My brain is lighting up listening to you all. Secondly, for Jason, right-wing populism as an aspect of settler colonialism. Oh, good. I'm glad we get this question. Would you please say more about that? Do you have any tools or frameworks to suggest for how we might respond to our daily lives to people sharing some of these extremist viewpoints?
The last one's tough, so the last part of that's tough, so I'm gonna avoid that for a second. Just on populism as not exclusively, but as it manifests itself across the settler societies that I'm familiar with, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and observing from the outside to some extent in Canada as well. I mean, if you look at the things that, say, the Bundys were responding to, they're responding to a situation where formerly white men on the land had kind of unlimited access to the resources, in public lands, pretty much, either unlimited or a bargain basement, at a bargain basement price. In the last few decades, public land management has come to incorporate other values, environmental values, some kind of consideration for Indigenous perspectives. I'm not saying that it's perfect or that any of that's complete, but these guys are responding to a diminishment of their prerogatives as white settlers, the kind of prerogatives that they have had, that white men have had since they arrived as settlers. I think that, also in Australia and the United States, a really good book on this, I think, on the history of this is Drawing the Global Colour Line by Henry Reynolds and Marilyn Lake. They're Australian historians, but they show how in the latter part of the 19th century, there was this kind of dialogue between Australian politicians and intellectuals, and in the United States as well. Teddy Roosevelt was involved in it. Of really defining these countries as white men's countries, and a lot of the sort of the challenges to empire, for example, that came in Australia were often made in the name of sort of a kind of white supremacist vision of the country. The Australian Founding Act was excluding people of colour from being immigrants, and in fact expelling a whole bunch of people. And the same thing was happening at around the same time on the West Coast, with populist campaigns for anti-Asian immigration restriction. And these folks were all talking to each other as well. So it was a kind of consolidation of the settler project that was happening as Australia was being fully colonized, and as the same thing was happening on the West Coast. And so every time one of these kind of populist waves hits, I think it's a sign that people are seeking to kind of either maintain that or reverse whatever progress has been made, so that they can have some more of that back. I don't want to be too reductive, but that's a productive way I have of thinking about it. As to what you can do about people, sharing these extremist ideas or extremist materials. Oh gee, I think I would want to defer to maybe Joan on that. I don't know. I still don't know what to do.
You want to pick that up, Joan?
Ideas I would defer to, because I tend to be more of an observer. Yeah.
The question was about people sharing.
How to respond in your own life to people who are embracing extremist ideas, or sharing extremist material. Well, not extremist. Sharing these kinds of ideas, or articulating these kinds of ideas. Like, what should you do?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I don't really feel like we have clear answers on this. There's a lot of talk about this, and a lot of people are sort of presenting themselves as experts on it. But most of the people that do this are connected to these think tanks that I'm critiquing, connected to this whole countering violent extremism narrative. A lot of them are former fascists who don't have any sort of training in psychology or criminology, and are just going off of a lot of their own life experience and what they've witnessed. But I do think, since we are an all-white panel, one thing we could talk about is, the power of, using our white privilege to have some conversations that other people can't. And we have to be thoughtful about our own safety. Everyone has to be. Once people are fully engaged in, say, fascist ideology, it becomes their identity. And I don't think it's worth trying to confront them or argue with them, or even just reach out to them and be nice to them in the hopes that that will change them. I don't think it's a productive use of time, and I think it just puts people in danger. But if you have a teenager who's starting to get sucked in, talk to your kids, see what they're seeing on the internet. If you know people in your social circles, like yoga moms, like suburban yoga moms are getting sucked into QAnon. People are on the internet just talking about organic food or yoga or their suspicion of vaccines. And then they're starting to go down these rabbit holes to the abyss of conspiracy theory hell. And so can we reach out to people earlier? Can we learn how to spot things? Can we learn how to have conversations and help people like anchor their identity in something other than these things that are sucking them in? Which is not to say they're not responsible for their choices, but I just think we have a power to, kind of rein people in sometimes before they go all the way down the rabbit hole.
Thanks, Joan. That's really very helpful. And thank you, Jason, for the elaboration on settler colonialism. There's a question for you, Joe, from actually one of the students who's taking this as a class connected to the webinar. So Gloria asks, could you expand on the tactics around language? How it's used to normalize white nationalist thinking and how it has been co-opted by by GOP rhetoric? And then she says, I'm thinking about Lee Atwater's quote on using code words like forced busing, cutting taxes, welfare, things that hurt African Americans more than white Americans. You're muted.
That's a really great question. And it's a complicated one because in a way, the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party was kind of founded on white racist backlash to begin with, you know, and they were responding in a broader party system to kind of a sense that America as a white nation, which Democrats and Republicans, white Democrats, Republicans all kind of embraced, was challenged fundamentally in the 1960s. So in a way, the Republican Party at that point became the party that would defend white interests. But in the post-civil rights era, they couldn't use that language, obviously. So, you know, as you see, Atwater, you know, uses, you know, what we now call dog whistle language or coded language. But you know, the ways to see it always it's often the deep themes there have to do with crime, or they're always used, or crime, I think, invasion, and welfare. All three as things that are, you know, that attack the white nation, you know, or destabilize it from within or from without. And I think, you know, for Republicans, the work that it did for them was that it allowed them to shrink public services generally. So the moment when Black and brown people are being led into public universities and demanding Black studies and ethnic studies in the early 1970s, that's when you start to see funding for higher ed dry up, you know, as in that moment. And then because the notion of the public itself gets darkened, gets blackened, gets more brown. The idea of who is included in the public, and as that happens, privatization kind of both, you know, becomes privatization for white people as well as privatization for wealthier people. So those languages kind of have worked really well together over time, I think. And you know, by the time you get to Trump, it's no longer coded though, right? He just openly uses that language and kind of brings it to the surface. But that, I think, is because the U.S. is almost no longer a white nation. You know, whites will soon move from being a majority to a plurality. So the idea of a silent majority doesn't really work in reality anymore because whites will no longer be the majority. The idea of middle America, which is the other one of the terms, that no longer really will work because the middle has kind of dropped out. So, you know, I think racial language, I think we are likely to see it become more stark and more open over time. But the ways in which it will get coded, I think, are back to this far-right patriot nationalism. And you can do it through, as Jason mentioned, Islamophobia and anti-immigrant, as defending the American nation from parasites and from outsiders. So I don't know if that helps, but I don't want to talk too long on this.
I think that does help. Yeah, and that actually.
And we have 3 minutes remaining in this section.
Thanks, Lisa. There's a question about, and this, I think any of you all might be able to answer this, but I wonder if any of you have thoughts on the alt-right internet pipeline that funnels young, impressionable youth to alt-right media via social media algorithms. And I know a lot of people have been thinking about social media with regard to rumor control, you know, in this sort of period now between election day and inauguration, and sort of how to stay in front of it. So, so if any of you want to sort of pick that up.
I mean, I think it's an important question, but I would slightly resist the idea that it's just young people we have to be concerned about. I mean, the stuff that's worried me the most in the last year or so, I mean, look, the alt-right thing, you know, which was so widespread and so, you know, concerning back in 2015, 2016, that movement has disintegrated somewhat, as have some of its successor kind of movements like accelerationism, and there's clearly still a lot of dangers out there for young men. But really, I mean, what I've been concerned about most in the last year or so is actually middle-aged people, older people getting sucked into things like QAnon, getting sucked into like patriot groups who are, you know, going to like take a look at the crowds outside the polling places, you know, in Nevada or Arizona right now. They're not necessarily young crowds. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, people of all ages are sort of, I don't much like the language of radicalization either, but they're being inducted into these communities of these epistemic communities on social media. And, you know, the bigger questions for me are kind of structural questions about how we kind of, you know, can kind of regulate something like Facebook in a way that you know, that maybe allows us to have some kind of handbrake on its kind of impact on people and on society as a whole, or YouTube for that matter. I think that's going to be a big question kind of going forward, because I don't see an age limit or a particular age group that's especially prone or immune to this kind of stuff. I don't know what you folks think.
I mean, I can kind of add to that a little bit because, it is across age groups, but I think we've had some particular concern maybe locally around this because we had some issues with high school students getting involved and forming their own alt-right club and also joining with some adult neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups. I can just suggest a few resources. So there's a nice handbook out for teachers that was put out by Western State Center called Confronting White Nationalism in Schools that you can find online. And that was, I think, in part a collaboration between Nora Flanagan, who's a high school teacher in Chicago, and Shannon Martinez, who's a former white nationalist. And if you look up Nora Flanagan and Shannon Martinez, they have some other materials online. Shannon.
Pardon the interruption.
Sorry.
Time is up for this section. I feel really bad cutting you off there, Joan.
You're good.
Go ahead and finish that one thought, Joan.
Yeah, so if you look up their work, there's also the Southern Poverty Law Center also had a webinar recently, and they're going to do another one soon on the same issue of youth radicalization that you could look at.
That's great. And as you were offering those resources, Joan, I was also thinking we're going to email folks who were part of this, who registered for this webinar in the next day or so, and we can include a list of the resources that you've mentioned. And Joe and Jason, if you have anything that you want us to include, Jason, we'll put your handout in that as well so that people have access to that. Joe, and if you want to include the slides from your PowerPoint, we could do that as well, depending on what you decide. So, I mean, so much to talk about, right? And we've just barely scratched the surface, but thank you all so much. And I want to, people who are local to Spokane, those of you who are not connected yet with the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, their website is pjals.org. So pjals.org is a good local resource. And then please do register and encourage others to register for the upcoming 2 sessions. So next Thursday we've got, which is November 12th, we have Indigenous scholar activists joining us, and then we take a break for a little while, and then on December 3rd, well, we're going to think with some immigration scholar activists around this topic of white supremacy in the Pacific Northwest and the election. Who knows where we will be at that point. But I'm just so happy to have had these fantastic panelists with us tonight, and please share the knowledge that you've learned today with others. We will email you more resources. And remember, we the people are powerful. Be well, everyone, and mask on. Thanks all.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.